When rushing water begins filling an underground cave system, every second becomes a fight for survival. 11 students and their teacher found themselves trapped deep beneath the earth, with rising water blocking their only way out. What started as an exciting school adventure would become a race against time, where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. The autumn morning felt perfect for outdoor adventures. Students from Tadcaster Grammar School had arrived at their week-long educational camp at Bewerley Park Outdoor Education Center in North Yorkshire. Among the excited teenagers were 3 close friends, Amy, Charlie, and Joseph. At 13 and 14 years old, they were looking forward to their independence away from home, especially with the holiday season approaching. The Outdoor Education Center had planned various activities for the nearly 100 students. They were split into smaller groups for safety and better supervision. Some groups went hiking along scenic trails. Others tried rock climbing or fishing by the river. Amy, Charlie, and Joseph's group of 11 students, led by their mathematics teacher and a young camp instructor, had drawn what many considered the most thrilling activity: underground cave exploration. Their destination was a fascinating cave system known for its impressive underground chambers. From the surface, the entrance appeared as nothing more than a modest opening in the rocky ground. But this small hole led to an incredible world beneath their feet. The 17-year-old camp guide had explored these caves many times before and knew every twist and turn of the underground passages. One by one, the students carefully lowered themselves through the narrow entrance, following the guide's detailed instructions. The initial passage was tight, but it quickly opened into their first underground chamber. The sight that greeted them was breathtaking. A massive room with a ceiling that soared 50 feet above their heads. Ancient stone formations hung like frozen waterfalls from the ceiling, and the space was nearly the size of a football field. The students were amazed by this hidden world. A few inches of water covered the rocky floor, but their waterproof boots kept them comfortable as they splashed through the shallow pools. Their headlamps cast dancing shadows on the cave walls, creating an almost magical atmosphere. What had seemed scary from above ground now felt like the adventure of a lifetime. Amy marveled at the ancient limestone formations that had taken thousands of years to form. She ran her fingers along the smooth, cold walls, feeling the history beneath her touch. Charlie was fascinated by the echo effects. Every whisper seemed to bounce endlessly through the chamber. Joseph, always the curious one, noticed how their voices carried differently in this vast underground space compared to regular rooms above ground. The guide explained how these caves were formed millions of years ago by underground rivers carving through the soft limestone rock. He pointed out different types of rock formations and told them about the wildlife that sometimes lived in these dark spaces. The students listened intently, their excitement growing as they learned about this mysterious underground world that existed right beneath their everyday lives. After exploring this magnificent chamber, the guide led them toward the next section of the cave system. They climbed down over rocks and through muddy pathways that descended deeper underground. The tunnel twisted and turned, taking them further from the surface with each step. When they emerged into the second chamber, they found another spacious room, though smaller and with a lower ceiling than the first. The water here was slightly deeper, reaching their ankles, but still manageable. The students continued exploring, their excitement growing with each new discovery. The darkness beyond their headlamps held mysteries they were eager to uncover. Amy noticed that the sound of dripping water seemed louder here, echoing off the lower ceiling in a rhythmic pattern that created an almost musical backdrop to their adventure. Charlie pointed out strange mineral deposits on the walls that sparkled in their headlamp beams like underground jewels. The guide showed them how to identify different types of cave formations and explained the slow process of how water shapes underground landscapes over centuries. Joseph was particularly interested in the small creatures they occasionally spotted, tiny spiders and insects that had adapted to life in complete darkness. The temperature was noticeably cooler than the chamber above, and some students pulled their jackets tighter. The guide reassured them that caves maintain a constant temperature year-round, usually matching the average annual surface temperature of the area. This natural air conditioning system made the caves comfortable in summer but chilly during their autumn visit. As they prepared to move deeper into the cave system, none of them realized they were about to encounter something that would change their lives forever. However, their next challenge would test their courage in ways they never expected. Ahead of them lay a much smaller opening, barely large enough for a person to crawl through. This tunnel was only a few feet high and quite narrow. To reach the next chamber, they would need to crawl on their hands and knees for more than 40 feet. The pathway was uneven, winding left and right, dipping down and rising up again. Sharp rock formations jutted into the passage, forcing them to carefully navigate around each obstacle. A small stream ran along the bottom of this crawling tunnel, soaking their clothes and making the journey muddy and uncomfortable. In the dim light, each student could only see the person directly in front of them. The guide called out instructions from ahead, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. Amy found herself focusing on Charlie's boots in front of her, using them as a guide through the darkness. The tunnel seemed to go on forever. Students who were naturally claustrophobic began to feel anxious about the tight space pressing in around them. Joseph, crawling near the back of the group, tried to stay calm by counting his movements. Left hand, left knee, right knee. The repetitive motion helped distract him from the uncomfortable feeling of being so far underground with solid rock just inches above his head. Some sections required them to squeeze through spaces barely wide enough for their shoulders. Other parts dipped so low they had to lie flat on their stomachs and pull themselves forward using their elbows. The cold water soaked through their clothes, and several students began shivering from both the temperature and nervous energy. Despite their nervousness about the tight space and poor visibility, there was also a sense of excitement about conquering this challenge together. They encouraged each other with whispered words of support, creating a bond that only shared adventure can forge. When they finally emerged from the crawling tunnel, the mood in the third chamber was different. The guide noticed something troubling. The water level seemed much higher than usual. It was a cold day with strong winds outside, but there had been no rain in the weather forecast. He couldn't understand why the water was so deep. What the guide didn't know was that miles away at Scar House Reservoir, powerful wind gusts were creating dangerous conditions. The reservoir, built in the early 1900s to supply water to nearby towns, was experiencing unusual wave action from the strong winds. These same winds that felt refreshing on the surface were about to become a deadly force underground. The students found themselves standing in knee-deep freezing water with nowhere to find dry ground. They had descended even deeper underground, and this chamber felt more confined than the others. Amy noticed her feet were getting numb from the cold water that had seeped into her boots. Charlie complained about the temperature, while Joseph tried to stay positive, joking that they were getting the full cave experience. At first, the constant movement of 11 people made it difficult to notice what was happening. But once everyone stood still, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. The guide watched in growing alarm as the water level crept higher on the cave walls. What had been ankle deep when they arrived was now reaching mid-calf on the shorter students. The water was rising. The guide's experience told him they needed to leave this chamber immediately. He instructed the teacher to lead the students back through the crawling tunnel they had just navigated. The teacher would go first this time, with the students following, while the guide brought up the rear to ensure everyone's safety. The return journey through the narrow tunnel began normally. In some sections, 2 students could crawl side by side, but other areas were more restricted, forcing them to move single file. The teacher and 9 students had entered the tunnel when disaster struck without warning. A powerful surge of icy water suddenly flooded into the passage. Students at the back began screaming in panic, urging everyone to move faster. Some found themselves kneeling in a foot of water, while others in the lowest sections were chest-deep in the rapidly rising flood. The water continued pouring in with frightening speed. The teacher quickly exited the tunnel and began pulling students to safety in the larger second chamber. The speed of the water's rise was shocking and terrifying. Several students became trapped before reaching the deepest section of the tunnel, knowing they would have to hold their breath and swim underwater through the completely flooded passage. In the cramped space at the top of the tunnel, students were crying and screaming in terror. Charlie shouted to the others that they had to swim through the flooded section, or they would certainly drown. He was confident he could hold his breath for at least 2 minutes and believed the underwater section couldn't be more than a few feet long. Taking courage from his words, he filled his lungs with air and disappeared beneath the surface. Back in the deepest chamber, only 3 people remained: Amy, Joseph, and their guide. The young instructor told them they had to swim through the tunnel immediately or face certain death. The water had risen to their shoulders and was nearly filling their only escape route. They had almost no air left in the shrinking space above the flood. There was a small air pocket near the tunnel entrance, but they had to duck underwater to pass around rocks and hanging formations. In one of these underwater sections, they encountered other students who had become trapped, desperately trying to find enough air to breathe and gather courage for the final swim to safety. The guide had planned to rest and catch his breath in this air pocket before swimming through the completely flooded section. But there was no room. Students were crowded together, struggling to keep their heads above water in the tiny space. It was pure panic, and time was running out fast. Amy and Joseph had no choice but to return to their starting chamber. But when they got there, the water had continued rising and was approaching the ceiling. Their guide told them to take the deepest breath possible and prepare to move. There was no time to wait. The water showed no signs of stopping, and their air was disappearing by the second. The 3 of them positioned themselves at the edge of their last air pocket. With a final gasp of precious air, they plunged underwater and began their desperate swim through the cramped tunnel. This time, the other students had cleared the passage, and the guide fought his way through the tight underwater section, pushing his face up whenever possible to steal a breath of air. Amy frantically pulled herself through the narrow underwater passage. Suddenly, she felt a strong hand grab her arm and yank her forward with tremendous force. The 17-year-old guide had managed to drag her through the final stretch of the flooded tunnel to safety. She gasped for air as she was pulled into the second chamber where the other students waited. But Joseph was nowhere to be seen. He had been the last to leave the air pocket, but by the time he reached it, there was no air left to breathe. The water had filled every available space. Whether he tried to return to the inner chamber or attempted to swim through the tunnel, both routes were now completely underwater. The freezing group in the second chamber was horrified as they realized what had happened. The water continued rising in their chamber, and they had no idea how high it might go. The tunnel behind them was completely flooded, and Joseph was still trapped somewhere in that deadly maze of water. The guide wanted to dive back and try to rescue him, but the teacher prevented what would have been a suicide mission. They still had 10 students who needed to reach the surface safely. With heavy hearts and the terrible knowledge that time had run out for their friend, the guide and teacher led the traumatized group back toward the surface. When they emerged from the cave entrance, they were shocked to see clear blue skies above them. There wasn't a single drop of rain anywhere. How could the cave have flooded so catastrophically on such a clear day? The answer lay in a terrifying coincidence that no one could have predicted. Strong winds that day had created significant overflow at a reservoir located above the cave system, causing serious flooding of the caves in the valley below. Thousands of gallons of water had surged from the reservoir down into the river and directly into the underground cave system. In just 1 hour, the river had risen 4 feet. Normally, this excess water would slowly trickle through the cave system and drain into the groundwater below. But the massive quantity of water from the wind-driven reservoir overflow had overwhelmed the cave's natural drainage capacity. The entire underground system had filled like a bathtub in a matter of minutes. Emergency rescue teams arrived at the cave within 20 minutes of being alerted. By then, the deadly flood had already begun to recede. The water level had dropped back below knee height, and the rescue team was able to enter the tunnel system. In the final chamber, they discovered what everyone had feared. Michael had not survived the flood. What was supposed to be an incredible educational experience had become a nightmare that would haunt the survivors forever. The tragedy raised serious questions about outdoor education safety and the unpredictable dangers that can emerge in natural environments. Legal proceedings followed, with charges brought against the county council that operated the outdoor education center. However, they were eventually found not guilty because the flooding event was deemed unforeseeable and unprecedented. Experts testified that this type of rapid flooding was completely out of character for the cave system. The investigation revealed that even experienced cavers and safety experts could not have predicted this particular combination of weather conditions and reservoir overflow. Modern cave safety guidelines emphasize that cavers should stay out of a cave that is prone to flooding if there is threatening weather, and that caves can flood quickly. However, on this day, the threatening weather was not obvious from ground level. The tragedy revealed how closely surface water and underground caves are linked. Rain, rivers, and even storms far away can affect a cave miles from where they begin. What seems safe underground can become deadly in minutes when things change above ground. For students, teachers, and families, this became a painful reminder of how quickly adventure can turn into disaster. The young guide, whose quick actions saved 10 lives, carried the heavy burden of not saving everyone. The teacher faced an impossible task, keeping children safe in a crisis no training could fully prepare him for. After the accident, the outdoor center made strict safety rules. Only trained guides could lead cave trips. Weather systems were improved to watch local conditions and water levels in rivers and reservoirs connected to the caves. Michael's death showed that nature is unpredictable and unforgiving. Even with skill, planning, and equipment, some dangers cannot be removed. The tragedy also proved the importance of emergency training and fast decision-making when every second counts. The survivors faced deep trauma. Some students needed counseling. A few never entered a cave again. Others worked to improve cave safety. The teacher lived with survivors' guilt, questioning every decision. Years later, the cave was rebuilt with better drainage and warning systems. But the main lessons stayed the same. When we enter nature, we must respect the risks and accept that some forces cannot be controlled. This story remains both a tribute to a life lost too soon and a warning about the hidden dangers below the Earth's surface. If you want to learn more about safety awareness and recognizing potential threats in various situations, subscribe to our channel and share this important message with others so everyone can stay informed and protected.